right, good morning.
Good morning.
There you go. That's what I like to hear. Give a couple people a couple extra seconds to get back in. As I was saying, I'm not the ushering type, so I'm very, all right, guys, all right. That's my wife. She's not here. But she's a school teacher, so she's really good at doing that stuff. It is good to be with you this morning. Because I haven't spoken yet, this is my first session. I do want to say thank you for being here, but also thank you to the Kannapolis Church of Christ for having us this weekend. Dean kind of said this last night, and I want to reiterate that. Hopefully this is not just educational, because again, we can only fit so much in these sessions, but we hope that it is edifying so that you will be able to go out and find other materials. Again, Dean mentioned some last night. We do have our book out there in the lobby. They are $5, and we hope that will kind of point you in the direction for other things as well, other resources. There's tons out there, so don't just take our word for it on these matters. Go and investigate it yourself. So that's one encouragement that I want to give you. What we're going to be talking about in this session is the reliability of the New Testament, specifically the historical reliability of the New Testament. Now, here's what I mean by that. We are not going to be discussing whether the New Testament has been inspired by God. That is a discussion for a completely other time, and we wouldn't even be able to scratch the surface on anything like that if we were to include it. What we are talking about with the New Testament is, does it pass some of the same tests that other ancient documents would also have to go through? We could almost say, does it measure up to other ancient documents that we have and that nobody disputes the historical reliability of? And what we're going to see is, when you start reading all of these other things and hearing debates and all of these other things that you might come into contact with, is that there seems to be a very strong bias toward the New Testament. For some reason, it is excluded from a lot of the other historical methods just because of some of the things that it has in it. A lot of the supernatural, a lot of claims by Jesus and other apostles saying that Jesus is divine. And so what we're going to see is, in those discussions, that a lot of people just automatically have a bias toward the New Testament, when the fact of the matter is that we have a lot of historical evidence to say, you know what, it deserves the same kind of attention as other historical documents that aren't disputed. And so that's kind of, we're going to, again, talk about some of those things this morning. But the first thing that we want to ask is, can we be sure that what we have in the New Testament today is what was originally written? Now, I'm not asking this question. I just want you to think about that. Have you ever thought about that before? Can we trust, or do we have in the New Testament today what was originally written? Especially considering some of these factors. The fact that we don't have the New Testament autographs, or autograph is a kind of a fancy word of saying the originals. It's not like we're getting somebody's autograph. It has a different connotation back then. We don't have the original New Testament documents. Also, no two copies of the New Testament that we have completely agree. Is the foundation kind of shaken right now? Also, among the closest...
Questions yet?
No, not yet.
Okay, go ahead.
This is the thought-provoking section.
Sorry.
Among the closest related copies of the manuscripts of the New Testament we have, there are about 10 differences per chapter. 10 differences per chapter. Again, is that foundation starting to shake a little bit? And what all of this leads to is about 300 to 400,000 differences among the New Testament manuscripts that we have. 300 to 400,000 differences. With this information, it seems that the New Testament doesn't even have a leg to stand on. How on earth can we trust that our Bibles have been accurately handed down from what was originally written? And it's almost like playing this game of telephone. And of course, we're all familiar with the game of telephone. How you start off with one thing, and by the time it gets to the end of the line, sometimes it sounds something completely different. How do we know that that's not the case here with the New Testament? Again, I want to point to that number, 300 to 400,000 differences among the New Testament manuscripts. I want to say something from the outset, and this is something really important to remember. Don't despair. This is not as bad as it sounds. And what a lot of people are going to do is they are going to put these numbers out there because we readily admit these numbers. But other people are going to take these numbers of the differences among these manuscripts and they're going to put it out there and they're going to say, see all of these differences, the New Testament cannot be relied upon. Because there are just too many differences among all the different manuscripts. Do not despair. That's my advice to you.
Wait, I thought you were the one that said if we're born, we struggle to die.
I did say that, and that's still true. That's a inside camp joke for those of you who don't know. I want to point to this chart that I made. It's adapted from the updated and revised version of Evidence That Demands a Verdict. It was originally written by Josh McDowell, but he brought on his son, Sean McDowell, for the updated version. And I just want you to look at this. These are not all of, but just a selection of some of the ancient documents that we have. A lot of them are going to be familiar to you. Some of them might not be. But I want you to just take a look at this. Homer's Iliad, which of course we're all familiar with Homer's Iliad. If you're in high school or going into high school, chances are you had to read that in English class or read a portion of it. The earliest manuscript that we have is from about 415 BC. And as of now, we have about 1,900 plus copies of Homer's Iliad. Now, of course, you see the old numbers and the new numbers up there. That's just kind of a comparison to see what we did have versus now what archaeology has uncovered now. So the number, of course, as you can see, the numbers kind of go up on that. Herodotus, he was a famous historian. The earliest manuscript that we have is about 150 to 50 BC. And now the newest manuscript number that we have, there are about 106 copies of Herodotus's histories. Going back over, we have Sophocles' plays, which the earliest manuscripts are from about the 3rd century BC, and now the newest number that we have is about 226 copies of Sophocles' plays, which, by the way, one of my favorite plays of his, and this is kind of a confession time for me, I don't know why I fell in love with the play Oedipus the King. And of course, for those of you who know what's in Oedipus, I don't know why I like it. Anyway, that's kind of confession time for me. Tacitus's Annals, first and second halves, about AD 50 to AD 1050. And of course, the newest numbers for that is we have about 36 copies of that. Going over to Demosthenes' speeches, we have about the 1st century BC, possibly earlier, and right now we have roughly about 444 copies of that. But now, out of all of those ancient documents, and the hundreds of copies, sometimes tens, but sometimes hundreds of copies that we have of those, now we have the Greek New Testament. The earliest copy or fragment of the New Testament that we have, Greek New Testament, is from about AD 130 or possibly earlier. And the newest number that we now have of Greek New Testament manuscripts is 5,856. 5,856 copies of the Greek New Testament. The New Testament is the highest attested ancient document that we have. And people actually want to say that it's not historically reliable. Yet we have all of these, we have an abundance of copies. Now mind you, this is just the Greek New Testament. Right now we're working with over 5,000 Greek manuscripts, but then we have to add to that 18,130 non-Greek manuscripts. These are translations. These are in other languages. These are New Testament manuscripts that have been found in the surrounding regions that have been translated from the Greek. And now we're looking at approximately 24,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. It is the highest attested ancient document anywhere. But this is also not to mention approximately 1 million quotations that are found in the early church fathers through the 13th century. Over 20 or about 24,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. Add on to that 1 million quotations from early church fathers. And what we find is that we actually have an abundance of manuscript evidence for the New Testament. I believe that the description of this has been, we have, and you're probably familiar with this, we have an embarrassment of riches. We don't even know what to do with it. Now, I want to go back to, what about those differences? Because if we're talking about 24,000 New Testament manuscripts, 5,000 in the Greek, about 18,000 from other languages, I mentioned that there are between 300,000 and 400,000 differences among all of those manuscripts. So what about those differences? The differences don't go away just because we have a lot of manuscript evidence. We still have to account for the differences. We can't just, kind of brush it under the rug and act like nothing ever happened. And unfortunately, that's what we sometimes do. And I'm not going to get preachy here, but I am going to say, if there's ever been a question that somebody has asked you, well, what about this? This manuscript says this, and then this manuscript says this. What about those differences? Sometimes we don't have answers for it. Or sometimes the cop-out answer that we have is, well, we just have to have faith. Well, we could say that with just about anything. Just have faith. But the differences aren't going to go away. We can't just ignore them. In their book, Reinventing Jesus, these are, the first name is kind of tough, so I'm going to pronounce it the best way I can. Other two are pretty easy. Kamaszewski, Sawyer, and Wallace, in their book Reinventing Jesus, break down the differences among the manuscripts into 4 different categories. The first category that we have are spelling differences and nonsense errors. And you want to know the good news about this? It's these differences that make up the majority of the differences among the manuscripts. Spelling differences and nonsense errors. How many of you have ever spelled a word wrong? Raise your hand. Okay. We've all done it. And here's the thing that sometimes, and especially when I started studying this, it kind of got to me at first until I studied it a little bit more, and that a lot of times when we think of the inspiration of the Bible, we think that the inspiration had to extend from the very first copies that were written all the way to where they were transmitted to us today. And that's not the case. Yes, sir.
Could you maybe explain the process of the scriptorium, how that would impact the manuscripts?
Meaning what?
Scriptorium would be, there would be a reader, and he will call out words.
Oh, sure.
Hearing differences as well as not knowing how to spell.
Well, and that falls into a few different categories. One of the things you're talking about there is dictating. So somebody would read it off, and then there would be a copyist who would write it down. Well, of course, if we've ever copied something down from somebody, especially through telephone, sometimes we don't hear exactly as the person said it, and so maybe we copy it down wrong. Another way of that is if a scribe is copying it from one document to another. Have you ever been typing something? Of course, we do type typing today. Nobody writes anymore. If you've ever been typing something, sometimes your eye will wander and you read one line and you're typing it, and then all of a sudden your eye skips down a line. And then you go back and read it and you're like, this makes absolutely no sense. Well, sometimes that would happen. A scribe would skip a line. But here's the thing about this. All of these different instances of copying it down and there being differences or mistakes, a lot of these things are easily and immediately identified. When we compare the manuscripts, we can say, oh, well, we can see what this copyist did here. They skipped a line because, obviously you compare one manuscript to the other, it's going to look and you're going to say, yep, that's exactly what happened. Or if there's a spelling difference, you can look at it, immediately identify it as, yep, that's a spelling difference. Because a lot of these Greek words is literally a difference of one letter. One letter. And so, yes, sometimes it changes the meaning of the word, but if you compare two manuscripts side by side, or even, again, the thousands that we have available, we can come to a pretty good conclusion as to what the original was supposed to say. Spelling differences, nonsense errors make up the majority of the differences. Many of these are not repeated. So sometimes if there's a spelling error in one manuscript, you're not going to find it in the next 10, 20, 30. So again, we have that attestation among the manuscripts. The second are minor differences that do not affect translation, or they involve synonyms. So in one manuscript you may have the description of Mary. But then in another manuscript you may have it where Mary is called the Mary. Or a lot of times we find it, and if you have an ESV, the ESV is really good about this. Of course, some people consider this the evil standard version. I just came up with that on the spot. You're welcome. You have the non-inspired version, then you have the evil standard version. The ESV is really good about doing this, in that you will find in the ESV a whole lot of footnotes in your pages. And a lot of them are pointing out, just openly and honestly, the differences among manuscripts. So in some cases, when you're reading in the actual paragraphs of the Bible, it will say Jesus. Then you'll look down and there will be a footnote that says, but a lot of manuscripts say he. So what the scribes did was to make clarity among their copy. Instead of just putting in he, they would make sure people understood that Jesus was being referred to. So some copyists would change he to Jesus. But these are minor differences. They don't affect the translation really, and a lot of them are just synonyms, just taking one word and replacing it with a clearer word if there's any sort of difficulty in understanding it. Yes?
Is there wrong translations and right translations?
I don't know that there are necessarily wrong translations and right translations. I think, are you talking about current modern translations?
Yeah.
I will say this, I think there are some that are better than others. And I'll keep it at that, because we could get into that debate and take up the whole entire day. But I appreciate your question about that. The third types of differences among the manuscripts are differences that do affect meaning, but that were probably not found in the original documents. So that's what it means by viable there. That they affect the meaning a little bit, but probably that's not what was originally written. Sometimes scribes would add words to help harmonize similar gospel accounts. So you take Matthew 9, for instance, where the Pharisees asked Jesus' disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But some manuscripts have added the words, "Why does your teacher eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And these scribes added "and drink" in some manuscripts to easily conform to Luke chapter 5 and verse 30, where Luke recorded "and drink." Yes?
What you're going through is this canon of textual criticism, in which which reading best explains this.
Right. Right.
The situation.
And they do that by, again, this plethora, this embarrassment of riches that we have is that if more manuscripts of Matthew do not have the words "and drink," but only a few do, chances are they're going to go with what the majority has. If the majority does not have "and drink," chances are Matthew didn't have "and drink" in his original composition. But again, what difference does adding the words "and drink" really make? It makes no difference whatsoever. This isn't a doctrinal issue. This isn't a matter of faith. It just so happens that some copyists decide to say, well, Luke has "and drink," and this is a similar account. They're describing the same exact event, and so we're just going to make it conform to it. The last set of differences, and these are the most, what are going to cause the biggest stink. But these, in actuality, make up maybe only about 1% of the differences that we have among the New Testament manuscripts. Differences that do affect meaning, and the jury is still out of whether this was in the original or not. It could be. One of my favorite examples is 1 John chapter 1 and verse 4. Where John says that, we've written these things to you so that our joy may be made complete. But then again, if you have the ESV, and it may be in other translations, you have the ESV, you look down and it says some manuscripts have our joy or your joy. That changes the meaning of the sentence. Is our joy being made complete? Talking about John and those who are with me? Or are we talking about your joy being made complete? Talking about the people that I'm writing to? That changes the meaning. But again, ultimately, what difference does that make? John's writing these things, and I'm sure that upon writing them, his joy is being made complete. And of course, when the recipients receive the letter, their joy will be made complete because of what John has written. Either way, the meaning has changed. The jury's still out of whether this was in the original or not. It could be. It could have been our. It could have been your. But there's no doctrine that's at stake. There's no contradiction necessarily among these two differing passages. It's just a matter of, is John talking about himself or is he talking about his recipients? Romans 5:1 is another one, where he says, we have peace, but then some manuscripts may say, let us have peace. So do we currently have peace, or are we about to get to the point to where we have peace? Again, it could have been in the original one way, or it could have been in the original the other way. We're not sure. But again, no doctrine is at stake here. There is nothing that we have to throw our hands up and say, well, because we don't know if they already had peace or they were getting to have peace, we can't trust the New Testament anymore because of something like this. So what? I just like asking that sometimes. So what? There's one more thing that I wanted to bring up about this, and it's actually from a blog that I wrote from a book that I was reading, and this is the first time that I heard about something like this. But here's the thing about it. This is still kind of unconfirmed as to whether this is actually the case, but it's possible. Which is why I wrote the blog about it. Because this may change the way that we think about the length that the New Testament documents were actually in use. Greg Monette, in his book, The Wrong Jesus, gives two pieces of evidence that actually point to a shorter manuscript chain than commonly thought. He first references research that's done by George W. Houston and Craig A. Evans. Houston's research in ancient libraries has shown that ancient documents were in use for an average of 200 to 300 years, with a larger range from 150 to 500 years before being retired. Evans builds upon this with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Of course, we know about the preservation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, probably one of the biggest and best discoveries for the reliability of our Old Testament and some of our New Testament. By the time the community who produced the scrolls had ceased, most of the scrolls were already 150 years old, with 40 of them, mostly biblical, being 200 to 300 years old. So it would seem that ancient documents had a longer lifespan than we commonly think that they do. Now, Monet's second piece of evidence comes from a quotation from Tertullian, who lived in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Now, during this time, there seems to have been some who were skeptic even then about the authenticity of the New Testament that they had at that time. And here's what Tertullian says. He encourages skeptics to go to the apostolic churches in which their own authentic writings are read, uttering the voice and representing the face of each of them severally. So Tertullian says, if you have any skepticism about what you are reading as far as the Word of God is concerned, go to some of these well-known churches and read the documents from the apostles themselves. Now, if Tertullian means authentic writings as the very first manuscripts, then Christians during that time were able to read the original writings of the apostles well into the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is the case, but it does make a pretty compelling argument that perhaps the original autographs were in use for a longer period of time than we commonly think, which would mean that some of the copies that we do still have of the New Testament may have been copied directly from the original autograph themselves. And that is something that is huge. But what are we talking about? Again, I wanted to bring that up because I think that that is so important. And again, that's a blog that I wrote on our website at Apologia Institute. So if you want to read that and see the citations, then please go check that out on our website. But so what? Well, one of the things is that the same tests that are applied to any other historical work are applied to the New Testament. The New Testament, as we saw, with 5,000 Greek manuscripts and over 18,000 non-Greek manuscripts, is unmatched in number. There is no other ancient document that is as well attested as the New Testament. And only about 1% of the variants change the meaning of the text. And some people even say, we're generous with 1%. In a lot of cases, it's less than 1%. Again, the majority of these differences among the manuscripts are simply spelling and nonsense errors that really don't mean anything, that are easily identifiable and easily corrected. Out of all of these differences, 300,000 to 400,000 differences, there is not one essential doctrine or belief of Christianity that is affected. There are no contradictions. So a lot of people will say, well, because there are differences, people automatically equate difference with contradiction. And that is not the case. The definition of a contradiction is that it cannot be A and not A at the same time in the same sense. But if we're just talking about a spelling error, that is not a contradiction, that's a slip of the pen. I want to leave you with this quote from Kamazuski, Sawyer, and Wallace, where they say, the manuscript copies of the New Testament are far more plentiful and earlier than any other Greek or Latin texts. In terms of manuscript data, any skepticism about the Jesus of the Gospels should be multiplied many times for any other historical figure. We have more and earlier manuscript evidence about the person of Jesus Christ than we do anyone else in the ancient world, including Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. And that is true. Nobody questions the existence of Julius Caesar. Nobody questions the existence of Alexander the Great, even though the manuscript evidence for them and some of the things they did is far less than the New Testament, and a lot of times There are completely differing accounts, almost borderlining on contradictions between some of the things that these great men did. But yet, when it comes to the New Testament, we have far more attestation in terms of number. There are fewer contradictions. And also, they tell about this person of Jesus Christ, but like I said before, why is it that the New Testament is singled out as not being historically reliable and these others are, when it has this wealth of evidence backing it up? That doesn't make sense to me. We have a few more minutes before we'll take a break. I do want to ask if there are anybody with any questions, any thoughts from some of the things that we discussed, anything that maybe you're unclear about that we can help clarify. Yes.
So, the Iliad and all those ancient manuscripts, are those stories or some of them all?
Here's the thing about that. They all, or most of them, like especially with the Iliad and the Odyssey, that already has the flavor of stories, of legends, of myths. The language that's in that is very much, you know that what you are reading is coming from somebody's mind. Whereas when you read the New Testament, they have the flavor of a biography. They have the flavor of these are things that we saw, that we heard, kind of like what John says in his letters and in his gospel, that these are things that we saw with our own eyes, that we heard with our own ears, and that we touched with our own hands. So the New Testament automatically doesn't have the flavor. In fact, the majority, even if we took the Gospels out, let's just take the Gospels out, and we look at the letters of Paul. Paul is not writing any sort of story. Paul is writing a letter to a congregation. And even in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which we're going to get to here in a little bit, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he says, I am delivering to you what I told you at first. So I'm just restating what I've already told you in person. So he's already writing a letter, so that doesn't have the flavor of any sort of story or making something up. But a lot of these others do. Yes?
I really like the quote by that one guy, Wallace, and the other guy.
Kamazuski?
Yeah. Because when you look at, say, Alexander the Great, the first biography of Alexander the Great is by Plutarch, which is 400 years after Alexander the Great has already passed.
Right.
And I think what you said is a great point, that there are not a lot of Julius Caesar doubters out there. There's not a lot of Alexander the Great doubters out there. But if we're going to take, like what you said, for instance, like Alexander the Great, if we're going to say that Alexander the Great was a factual person, well, you can't say that Jesus wasn't a factual person because of the time between when Jesus lived and when these documents were written.
Right.
Because then you have to say, well, Alexander the Great wasn't a real person because the first biography of him is 400 years after the fact. I think that's a great point that they make and that you've demonstrated in the manuscript.
And I've been reading more and more, and that's a good, because they mention it here, we have more and earlier manuscript evidence than for any other historical figure. And I think that that's a really good point, because I've been reading more and more of people jumping on board with not the liberal dates of when the Gospels were written, but a pretty more conservative date, that probably all four Gospels were written prior to AD 70, the fall of Jerusalem. I'll go ahead and say that I'm kind of a firm believer that they were all written pre-AD 70. I'm not gonna disfellowship with you if you think differently. But I think that there's ample evidence, external and internal, that they were written before, and that's 40 years, well, at the most 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And if we are talking about that's just when they were written down, you have oral tradition that is coming right after Jesus' resurrection. Yes, sir?
In this day and age, atheism and skeptics are not just hovering in academia, they're out in the public place,
Right.
Confronting Christianity and trying to discredit Christianity. And I don't know the first two gentlemen, but Daniel Wallace,
Yeah.
people that spend a lot of time confronting these allegations that they make
Yep.
out there. If you want to go out to YouTube for a debate between Daniel Wallace and, say, Bart Ehrman, who has written quite a bit, always on a popular level,
Right.
About discrepancies and issues against theology and the Word of God. Daniel Wallace does a pretty good job of dealing with it.
You know, and Daniel Wallace is actually the name that I recognize first before the other two names. Daniel Wallace is a